Hello, I'm Arboltus, and today I want to talk a little bit about my opinion on the Enlightenment. Now, this recording or video that I'm making here is not really going to be scripted or anything in detail, so I'm going to ramble about a bit. So if you're concerned about that, well, that's what's going to happen. So anyway, the Enlightenment. I want to say that my general opinion about the Enlightenment is that although some of the ideas of the Enlightenment are, in my opinion, good ideas, some of the ideas are in some ways beneficial and functional. I do not, in general, agree with many of the conclusions that the Enlightenment philosophers made. For example, a lot of Enlightenment philosophers had this opinion that everything could be reasoned out in some respect, even ethics in that sense. Now, while I do not agree with the opponents that they had in their time that talked about a sort of chaos and an idea of emotionality and things like that as being more important than reason, and many of these individuals had a sort of obscurantist mindset. Uh, I'm talking about the anti-Enlightenment philosophers, some of them at least of that time. I I agree with the Enlightenment philosophers that reason is something that is useful, something that is beneficial in discovering many things and in being able to really understand more about the universe. However, I disagree with some of the conclusions that they came to. And in that sense, I myself, as a philosopher, am opposed to the general conclusions that many of the Enlightenment philosophers made, such as the conclusion of the goodness of, let's say, democracy, as some Enlightenment philosophers have, or the ideas of the importance of social contracts, or ideas on, let's say, natural rights, which weren't invented by Enlightenment philosophers but became more popular around that time. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. I do not believe that those things are derived in a rational sense, uh, not in the sense that they are necessarily irrational, but rather in the sense that that is not how rights are established, that is not how rights are generally derived. So in that sense, I also disagree with Thomas Aquinas, who is not an Enlightenment philosopher, but came long before that. In the sense that my theory for the derivation of rights is very different from that of the Enlightenment philosophers, or at least many of them, and in how they pursue things. Now, questions such as the division of powers, I think that is something that is useful. However, at the same time, there are certain situations when that is not useful. So I tend to view the tools that the Enlightenment philosophers, especially in a political sense, created as things that are neutral rather than things that are good, in the sense that they are things that can have a benefit or can be harmful depending on the situation that they're used in. In that sense, I am a realist in the sense that I see that there's a real world that all these ideas interact with, and that these ideas do not always interact with the real world in the way that some of these philosophers expect those ideas to interact with the real world. So let's talk about reason, for example. Reason is, of course, can be considered a type of knowledge, a body of knowledge, a you could even call it a a cosmos of knowledge. But reason in itself is not fundamentally useful unless there's something to be reasoned. In that sense, reason is useless if there is no real world. So the real world exists independently of reason, because otherwise it would be incoherent. So then, of course, reason is useful insofar as it corresponds to the real world. But then again, if you then look at most people in the world, even today, believe in some sort of transcendent entity or force in the universe that is in control of the universe in some sense, or set things in motion in some sense. Now, how does that relate to reason then? Well, what this establishes is another force, another body of knowledge. So you have reason and logic, and you also have the natural world, as we know it, the real world. And then you have another body of knowledge, which is, let's say, questions of divine revelation and things like that, which are distinct from logic. And a great example in how these things are distinct from logic is the Ten Commandments, for example. Now, let me be very clear on the question of whether these things, on whether these religious principles are true or not, in the sense that they correspond to the real world, does not change the fact that there are many people that act as if they are true. And what that means that is that if you're trying to build a society, you have individuals that believe that there is a sort of moral truth that is not derived from the natural world and is not derived from reason. And therefore, these individuals have a desire to be obedient to such thing that is, I would not say irrational, but rather a-rational, in the sense that it is not necessarily opposed to rationality, because in their worldview it is rationalized, nor is it rational in itself, because it is not a rational quality, but rather something else. So in the Ten Commandments, you have the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And of course, from the internal elements of a religion, especially a monotheistic religion, that makes sense. But if you do not have a revelation on which gods exist or which gods do not exist, then that is not something that is rationally derived. So, in that sense, assuming pure rationality in itself, and not assuming perhaps a revelation, or perhaps something that is seen in the real world, but rather in only the cosmos of rationality and logic, that is not something that can be derived. And therefore, that, as a moral imperative, as a commandment, is not rational, which means that it is incompatible with any viewpoint that attempts to define things as purely rational. The second commandment, the command not to build idols, is something that is also not rational in that sense as well, because it requires a certain form of revelation. And the third commandment is another one where it's against the idea of blasphemy. Thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain. Uh, and that is something that is also, at this point, not only is it not rational from the perspective that you don't know a God, But rather, it is also not rational from the perspective of even if a God exists, because what this is expressing a particular preference from that God. In other words, it is an aspect of partiality, an aspect of sentiment that is irrational, and that is expressing a particular element of the character of that God, and is then saying that this is something that is going to be enforced upon a people. So now what you have is an irrational law that is being enforced upon a people that, in the context of the Ten Commandments, know that a God exists and that have seen the power of that God through various miracles. And now what they have is a commandment that, based on what they saw in their real world, what they saw, the miracles that they saw, is something that is not naturally derived. Now, of course, the idea of being respectful to someone is something that is very common in an ethical perspective. However, it is not something that is necessarily rational in that sense. So then you go to the fourth commandment. And what is that? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why? Because God created the world in 7 days, and on the seventh day he rested. I'm paraphrasing here. I think it may have said 6th day, and then the 7th day he rested. But anyway, the point is that this is something that is then referring to an event that these individuals have not witnessed, and therefore is not real in that sense to them. However, it is real in the sense that it is being told them from someone who does say that he experienced this. However, the idea of resting because God rested is another aspect that is irrational. Because why should you do the thing that your God is doing? Why should you do the thing that your God wants? Uh, in a in a purely rational universe, that is not something that is justifiable. However, it is justifiable if, instead of deriving your morals from rationality, you derive them from a sort of system of authority, in which case this is something that is rational, as it is something that is then descriptive of that character. Now, let me be very clear here. These commandments, the 10 Commandments, are not just simply 10 suggestions that, in the context of the theology anyway, all of this is in the context of the theology that were made. But if you violated the fourth commandment, if you worked on the Sabbath day in a way that was unlawful according to that commandment, the penalty was death. So that, of course, puts it in a very real sense that this is something that was strictly enforced. And I think that is what lends the power to that law, is the fact that it is strictly enforced and that people who violate it are punished. Because if you then were to establish a law and people would be able to disobey it and they would be no worse off, then what's the point of the law at all? So in that sense, it is done that way. Now, people would object, saying that that it's wrong to just kill someone because they worked on a day of the week that they shouldn't have worked. That's what some people will say. And to that, the theologian would respond, well, what's your authority on that? And the answer is going to be either that they have a different revelation, that they have something that contextually changes it, or that they don't have an actual piece that corresponds to that in the same way, because it is a different form of derivation for, let's say, ethical thought than rationality itself or nature, which is not to say that it is irrational, because in the context of these things, let's say hypothetically, if all these things are real, are true, and did happen, then it is rational in that sense. And that if we take the idea of authority as a legitimate method of establishing laws and rules and authorities, which it historically is the primary way in which these things were done. Because let's say a country, any country, a country might have laws, and the power that causes people to obey those laws is the ability of that country to punish people who disobey those laws. And that's why when let's say in a big city and the police isn't very strong, maybe they're understaffed, what happens is that you end up having gangs rise up. You end up having racketeering. You end up having other groups fill this vacuum of power, and people committing various crimes because they know they can get away with it. And in that sense, that is one thing that happens. So then, to add another level of complexity, that's just the let's say Judaists and the Christians have a different perspective, in that laws are fulfilled in the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ, who then acts as high priest, etc. So in that sense, Christians would not kill people for working on the Sabbath. Uh, and then in Islam, there are entirely different ideas on that as well. So then what you have a question of is that you've got the Christians who believe that they have a certain revelation. You've got the Judaists, and especially the rabbinical Judaists, believe also in an oral Torah that has been passed down from generation to generation and was later written down, which is something that the Christians do not acknowledge as being a proper revelation. And then you have got the Muslims who have the Quran, and they also, to some extent, have authority in the Hadith. And then back to the Christians, you've got various denominations also have a belief in a authority of the church as a body to determine doctrine, especially the Roman Catholics. So you've got the church tradition on that, and then there's other sides that reject the idea that that's a valid authority. So the sola scriptura types. So ultimately, you've got all these different ideas, and they all, in some respects, have a belief in a sort of divine or deific revelation that justifies particular moral imperatives. And then what you're going to say, what the Enlightenment philosopher is going to say, we're going to all get all these different people that have different views on morality to logically agree on certain points, and then we can all bring them in together and live in harmony in the same society. And unfortunately, these people have incompatible beliefs regarding morality. And because of that, they will not be able to come to a consensus on this. And in fact, if we use reason as the basis of this consensus, the majority of the people, or at least in the world today, at least on paper, believe in some form of divine revelation, which means that the majority of people in the world cannot derive their moral principles purely upon reason, because there are certain moral principles that cannot be derived from reason. And even with reason in itself, it does not lend necessarily a weight or validity to such moral conclusions, such as, let's say, self preservation is something that people believe is something that is very natural, something that is very logical, something that is consistent with utility. But very frequently, you have individuals that ignore that. You've got thrill seekers who put themselves into dangerous situations where there might be a significant chance of death. You have soldiers who go to war. You have suicidal individuals who want to kill themselves, and all sorts of other groups that have that. And in a collective sense, you might say, well, what about collective preservation? Well, that also is something that is violated in many ways as well, where there are individuals who selfishly choose to prefer the deaths of others, even if it would hypothetically be the whole rest of the world, over themselves. At all costs, they are in favor of their own survival. So those individuals emphasize their own self-preservation over the preservation of the group. So you have individuals that don't care about preservation whatsoever, people that try to get a balance, people that prefer themselves, people that prefer the group, and all these people are not going to come to a consensus. So ultimately, what you end up with is a situation where this consensus that the Enlightenment philosophers hoped would bring in a new age of prosperity and peace is something that simply does not exist. And that you have people who are violent, people who are, in a classical sense, malevolent, people that have a death wish, people that are bloodthirsty, people that have a high degree of schadenfreude, and all these people exist. And if you want to build a society in this world, you have to account for the existence of all these people. And so what this means is that this dream of an ideal land where everybody gets along for reason is simply a dream, because it does not correspond to the actual fact of the world, that individuals uh, do not reason the same way, and therefore cannot reach such a consensus that such a system would require. So then what about democracy? Well, I've already mentioned that there is a real world that is independent of the world of reason, and that depending on what your goal is, that there are options that are going to obviously be better than other options. And this is something that I think is a demonstrable fact, that certain options are superior at achieving certain goals than other options. So then what you're going to do is you're going to say that even though we know that certain options are the better options, we're going to let people choose anyway. And we're going to give people the opportunity anyway to choose the worse options. And of course, that's a very silly position to have. But then, of course, on authoritarianism, in contrast, you have the question of, well, we know that certain options are better than other options, but we don't all agree which options are better than other options. So what if we pick someone to take these options who then simply makes a bad choice one after another? So that's authoritarianism out of the window. So ultimately, what you end up is a system where you have to give people options, but also derive some form of expertise in order to make these things work. Um, so let's say the Enlightenment. Where does the Enlightenment come from? The Enlightenment, in some ways, is a movement defined by a sort of reasoned criticism of existing institutions that existed in Europe uh, at its time. So this trend of criticizing these institutions is probably a natural outpouring of medieval scholasticism, in a sense that there was a scholasticism and a study that was very common among monks. But as the Black Death hit and the labor pool became smaller, which meant that labor became more valuable, which caused people to uh, poorer people to get more wealthy, which meant a growing middle class, which meant a higher availability for education. And this led to a greater body of people who were now engaged in thinking about the classics, about theology, and about other fields of study. And then you've got the Renaissance, where that is outpoured into the artistic efforts of that time. But ultimately, this also gave rise to the evangelical movement, better known as the Protestant Reformation, as theology is something that is ubiquitous to every person, um, as it is as theology matters in a sense that depending on what your theology is, it changes a lot about your worldview. It changes a lot about how you're going to behave. It changes a lot about what your ethical code is. And ultimately, this causes broad effects in a society. So what happened with Martin Luther is he encountered the idea of indulgences and he criticized them. You've got the 95 Theses. Now, of course, this isn't something that was particularly new. You've got Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt, who did the same thing shortly before Martin Luther, and who also was someone that had been one of Martin Luther's teachers. So, in that sense, it is not something that is strange or unusual. The posting of the 95 Theses is not should not be seen as such a revolutionary action as many people see it. I think the bigger effect, the greater event in the early Reformation is more of a Leipzig disputation, where a lot of Martin Luther's views crystallized. But ultimately, Martin Luther, in his attacks on indulgences, had to naturally criticize certain elements of ecclesiology, which include the authority of the Pope and some elements of Roman Catholic tradition. And ultimately, his study on this and his justification for his viewpoints on this ended up being rooted in the ancient scriptures of the Bible, which led to eventually him having particular views on soteriology, which is the bondage of the will. One of his most famous published works, which ultimately, of course, in combination with other things such as the Leipzig disputation, led to his excommunication and to his eventual ban by the Holy Roman Empire. So, in that sense, he became an outcast, and as his ideas, however, spread because of the ease of which they could be copied due to printing methods that had arisen in that time, uh, these ideas spread to other parts of Europe and led to other people being also critical of the long-held traditions of the church. So you've got individuals like Zwingli who started at around the same time as Luther. You've got the affair of the sausages, pretty interesting story if you ask me. But ultimately, what you see now is an essence of criticism, an essence of skepticism about old traditions and about the justification for various imperatives that are being placed upon the people by the religious authorities, and so this, in some respects, uh, leads to actually a disagreement between Zwingli and Luther, particularly when it concerns the idea of the Lord's Supper or Eucharist or whatever you would like to call it, or communion, and where Zwingli had rejected the old traditions even farther than Luther had on that point. But this idea, of course, crystallized further on in John Calvin and in others who began to systematize the theology, and had this idea that every element of doctrine needed to be something that was justified by its source, which is the scriptures. So, in that sense, the theologians spearheaded a sort of opposition to the old order and this idea of having to justify everything in some sense. Now, how did they justify these things? Well, you had the source of the raw information, which is the revelation of the scripture in that context, and then you put it together. And how do you put it together? Obviously, in order to understand anything, you need to reason through it. So that's where reason comes into it. And so they reasoned and they got to that. So eventually individuals, not just then, but in other spheres, started to look around themselves and trying to ask, how does this work? Why does this work? What is our understanding of how this works, and is our understanding on how this works justified? So you get the scientific revolution. And then when it concerns the idea of rights, the idea of government, the idea of ethics, you end up with a major portion of the Enlightenment. So then my issue with the Enlightenment is that ultimately it does not correspond with the reality that we see in the world. In other words, when what I see some of the Enlightenment philosophers do when they reasoned, ultimately, I believe that many of them reasoned in a way that instead of leading them to have a more based and accurate view of the world, they ended up just shifting their bias into a different direction. And for example, the idea of rights, things that are good, things that are just, rights, while people like to say that they are logically derived, people like to say that they are derived from nature, that they are derived from utility, that they are derived from pragmatics or from other things. Ultimately, what determines your rights is your authorities. Ultimately, that's how the world functions. In other words, this is an observationally true element of the world, that you might imagine your rights to be in a certain sense. However, if your authorities disagree with you on what your rights should be, then if you yourself don't have any power to resist that authority, then what are you going to do about it? The answer is that you're not going to do anything about it, and those rights evaporate because they didn't exist in the first place, because it is more an illusion of the mind, a wishful thinking that is developed based on these ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers. Now, freedom. The idea that freedom is a value that should be uh, present in all society is something that, when I discussed the incompatibility of various viewpoints, the idea of freedom falls apart. Because what you have is a viewpoint where individuals desire for a justice to exist, for some authority to exist that will protect them in some way. And the the Enlightenment thinkers tried to rationalize certain central principles to be the foundation of this. But ultimately, most systems of ethics, most of systems of ethics that are implemented by people go beyond those those rationalizations. And for example, you've got Sharia law, and there's different schools of jurisprudence in Sharia law, and you might say uh, that it is unjustified to have Sharia law, and there's many people that say that. And and let's say in Western liberal countries, what you very frequently have is certain Islamic communities get together, and what they see is that the country that they live in is not doing what they consider is right, which is to enforce certain elements of law that they have in their Sharia law. And therefore, they end up creating Sharia courts within those countries that, in some cases, might illegally convict individuals, illegally, according to the laws of the country, convict individuals of having committed certain crimes that are not crimes in that country in itself. So you have questions of wrongful imprisonment, questions of vigilantism, questions of perhaps what would be a lynching. And the reason why they do this is because they see the government as being unjust according to their law, because the government is not punishing individuals who do things which are, according to them, very wrong. So to make this relatable, let me hypothetically say you lived in a society, let's say an isolated island in the Pacific, where nobody has the expertise to build boats to go somewhere else. So the only option is to either live in this society or die. Okay, where, let's say, rape was entirely decriminalized. Now, you might say that's kind of absurd, but that's the point here, that this is something that most people would disagree with. So, therefore, most people will be able to relate to this situation. Rape is entirely decriminalized, and anyone that commits rape is not necessarily commended, but is allowed to go free, and the government will protect those individuals from any form of vigilantism or prosecution. So, what are people going to do? Well, most people themselves, obviously, since rape is categorically involuntary, nobody wants to be raped. Now, additionally, individuals might have parents that they don't want to get raped. They might have spouses that they might not want to get raped. They might have siblings that they might not want to have raped, and they might have children that they might not want to have raped. So, what are these people going to do? These people are going to get together and are going to illegally form their own courts in order to arrest and punish rapists. That's what they're going to do, because that is what is consistent with their moral values. So, what this means is that in a free society, you have a problem that, because not everybody can agree on what things are should absolutely be enforced in a society, you have a problem that people will, in pursuance of their own moral code, they will have to break the law. And this, of course, causes a problem if you're trying to establish a country and you're trying to run it smoothly, because you're always going to have a class of people that are defined by their common ethical viewpoint that are going to break the law in some sense. And this is the viewpoint that anti-abortion terrorists have, is that the government has allowed something that they consider to be absolutely morally reprehensible, that the government has allowed people to get away with it, and in some senses even has supported those individuals. So the anti-abortion terrorists are doing what they believe is right in attempting to save lives in a according to their viewpoint, in attempting to exact a form of justice that they believe is necessary to enact in their society. So, for individuals that are anti-abortion, this is a very serious question that they have to ask themselves. The question of, if this is happening, am I okay with this happening in my society, with someone doing something that maybe perhaps even next door from me that is absolutely morally reprehensible and an abomination to me? That is something that they have to wrestle with, and that is something that they have to deal with. And unfortunately, for the society at large, there are people that are going to come to the conclusion that that is not something that they can tolerate. And this is where you get these forms of terrorism. This is where you get lynching. This is where you get even certain types of racketeering. This is where you get certain gangs coming in. And this is, in some respects, a destabilizing factor in liberal societies. So then what about illiberal societies? Well, you have a similar problem, but in the other direction, where now people are being forced to conform to a particular order. And uh, and as I said, people do not. There are many people that cannot reach a consensus, and when they cannot reach a consensus, and when they're being forced by force of violence to obey a particular order with which they cannot reach a consensus, they might very well respond in violence as well. So what you have is that in both types, in the totalitarian type and in the libertarian type, the natural moral inclinations of various groups, well, natural in the sense that they are previous to the establishment of such a government, the moral presuppositions of various groups are going to cause violence, and and there you go. So that's why in the system that I suppose, that there is a broad room for local governments to have a broad range of power regarding social and economic issues, because they can then establish communities with common values that are able to enact these forms of justice in their communities, at least to a certain extent, so that it helps minimize this form of violence that is caused by these differences. And if you're trying to build an empire, which is to say that you're trying to build a country that can expand beyond a homogenous group, then this is something that is necessary to some extent. And so what we have is, let's say, in the Holy Roman Empire, you have the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics, and you also have the Calvinists, which early on, or the Reformed branch, which early on were essentially no one cared about them at early on, and you have the Peace of Augsburg that occurs because there was war in the empire. There's different groups, and they cannot agree on the proper religion that the empire should have, whether it should be Roman Catholic, whether it should be Lutheran, or evangelical Lutheran to be more exact. They call themselves evangelicals, but to distinguish themselves from the Swiss who went a Zwingli direction and also called themselves evangelicals, they were the evangelical Lutherans. So what you have is the principle of cuius regio eius religio. Now, I, I don't have that fully memorized, nor am I reading this off of somewhere. So if I got it wrong, if I functionally misspelled the word, then or mispronounced it due to a mental misspelling, that is to say, then I apologize. But essentially, the idea is that in each jurisdiction, the prince or the local ruler would have the ability to choose whether he wanted to be a Roman Catholic or an evangelical Lutheran, and that would therefore be the religion of his region. Now, this worked in some aspects because it caused a somewhat of a peace, because the empire didn't have to be religiously uh, unified and unanimous, and it allowed people of the two groups at least to have a freedom where they can establish their own distinct ecclesiologies and their theologies, and can live by them. Now, of course, the Anabaptists, nobody liked them, and the Reform branch, they got kind of screwed over on that as well. So, uh, of course, things changed later on, but later on, eventually, the problem occurred that there was a balance of power issue, um, because different countries, different lands within the empire held different religions. But let's say the ruler of one land converted to a different religion, then it would mean that the entire land belonging to that ruler would also have to convert, which meant that there would be war. Now, of course, uh, serfdom still existed to some extent. This was, of course, in the early modern era where serfdom was in rapid decline, but nevertheless, the majority of a population, as I understand it, were still agrarian. So the majority of the population had an interest in a vested interest in the land that they lived on, which meant that moving for most people from one land to another was not necessarily a viable solution, especially if they lived under a feudal system where they themselves were not the owners of a land, which would mean that if they moved, they wouldn't be able to simply sell the land and buy land somewhere else in order to deal with that. So this meant that if your ruler changed religions, it would be a pretty big deal in your own life as well. And it also was a big deal for the balance of power. So what you have in the 30 Years' War is that you have the Holy Roman Emperor died, who also was in personal union with the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was a sub-kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. And the the nobles of Bohemia decide that because they're more Protestant, that they might want to elect a Protestant ruler rather than a Catholic ruler. So there you have the religious aspect on that. But you also have a political aspect because the next ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and of Austria is a Roman Catholic. So obviously he's not going to be the next ruler of the Kingdom of Bohemia under this idea. And this means that a large amount of land held by his predecessor is now not held by the following ruler, which is a big problem. And it also is a significant portion of the country that has switched sides, religiously speaking. And this, of course, is unacceptable. So this leads to a huge war. Now, of course, there's other elements in that. You have the 80 Years' War, which was already happening at that time, and the Prince of Orange, uh, sort of behind the scenes supporting a Protestant to become the King of Bohemia as well. And that could be seen as another portion of strategy leading to the 30 Years' War. But ultimately, after the 30 Years' War, you have the Peace of Westphalen, and that one offered a more broader range of religious liberty and things, etc. Meanwhile, in France, things went a bit of a different direction, and although originally religious liberty had been guaranteed in some respects when the Bourbon dynasty came to power, later rulers ended up repealing that and suppressing uh, French Protestants to the point that many of them ended up fleeing the country into other places, such as Germany, for example. A lot of them moved there. But anyway, the point is that these are religious tensions that are caused by a desire for uniformity that led to conflict. Just like I mentioned, religious tensions caused by the government being, let's say, somewhat too laissez-faire can also lead to conflict as well. So you have a situation where the government, in some aspects, is disadvantaged if they let things run too loosely, but also disadvantaged if they grab things too closely. So you have to essentially create a balance, not necessarily a direct balance uh, on how much the government holds onto things, but rather balance on which aspects the government holds strongly, which aspects the government delegates, and which aspects the government does not hold. And this form of division of power ultimately is one that is not entirely compatible with the ideas of the Enlightenment, who viewed, some of them viewed freedom as a good in itself and as a right in itself, which under this idea, uh, it certainly is not. At the same time, property, for example, who's going to have property if there is no one to defend that property, and therefore property rights are ultimately established by some form of authority, whether it is your own authority, the authority of your family, the authority of a government, or the authority of God. And so, in that sense, that is something else that is established in that way. So then you have the United States, which was founded upon, in some respects, upon Enlightenment principles. Now, of course, early on, the Anti-Federalists may have been a bit more enlightened than the Federalists in their viewpoints, but I want to say that ultimately the United States had some, and still has, some structural problems. And and the origin of my political ideology is in some respects viewed on an analysis of these problems and the ways to fix such problems. So I originally thought about, let's say, Donald Trump as a leader, and in the sense that he was not someone that I particularly liked being the leader of a country. So then the question becomes, who is an ideal leader of a country? And and obviously from a theological perspective, that would be a perfect person, and the Christian perspective is that Jesus Christ is the ideal leader. But in that sense, that is not something that is part of our current political sphere. So that's not something that is actionable as an authority in that sense. So instead, it is up to humans themselves to essentially establish these systems of authority in a way that is functional. So then the question is, obviously, you want leaders that are effective, leaders that have expertise. Now, some people take the view of a technocracy. Some people take the view of having an educated democracy. Um, but ultimately, my view was that there's a reliability uh, that is best described through interpersonal relationships. And therefore my view really strongly emphasizes that expertise is best understood and communicated through a personal relationship rather than through a distant relationship, as in the United States many politicians have. And so, and I think this is partially caused by a failing of the American system of government. Now, people might say that it's sort of absurd to say that the American system has failed because the United States is at the current time the most powerful country in the world and has a massive economy and is very successful. And even if you and that's of course excluding uh, the parts that of the world that the United States does not nominally rule, but have hegemony over as well, which technically you could also consider part of the United States in that sense, similar to how the ancient Romans had their client kingdoms as well. Because one thing that keeps a sort of uniformity in the law of the United States, is the reliance of many constituent states of the United States upon the funds of the central government, the federal government. So the federal government can essentially decide that the states uh, deserve certain amounts of funds. And if a state does something that is disagreeable to the central government can choose not to give those funds to the state. Now, certain states are financially independent, so that's not as big a problem to them, but there are many states that are not financially independent, which means that those states are in some ways beholden and reliant upon the monetary funding from the federal government, which means that if the federal government doesn't like what one of the states is doing, the federal government can just reduce funding and sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge the states to fall into line. And in that sense, states' rights are suppressed in some ways because the states themselves are reliant upon the federal government for their funds. At least a large number of states are. And I will argue that in a similar way, there are foreign countries, countries that are not nominally part of the United States, that are also in some ways financially dependent upon the United States in a very direct sense. A big example would be the recent Ukraine scandal, where the question was whether Donald Trump had withheld funds that Congress had apportioned to the government of the Ukraine uh, in exchange for certain information. But of course, what people aren't picking up upon is that there's money that the U.S. government is sending to the Ukraine. Now, the U.S. government wouldn't be sending money to the Ukraine if the Ukraine wasn't doing something that the U.S. government was approving of, or if the U.S. government wasn't trying to effect a certain change within the Ukraine. And so, in some sense, it can be said that the Ukraine is in that sense a bit of a client state of the US, as it relies upon the US for certain things, and countries that the United States doesn't like uh, end up getting sanctions put upon them, embargoes. They might have funding that was given to them removed, and there you have it. So that's the way that the U.S. One way that the U.S. exercises a form of hegemony around the world is by funding various things. So money, in that sense, means a lot. And it also means a lot in politics, in internal politics and in elections as well. If you follow the money, then you can follow the power. And that's why a lot of people don't like George Soros, because he's got a lot of money that he's sending towards causes that a lot of people don't like. So there you go on that issue. So what are the structural failings of the American system? Well, you might say, well, the United States is very successful, so how could it possibly have structural failings? Well, I can tell you that it has structural failings from the very beginning. Otherwise, there would not have been 10 amendments added to the US Constitution so quickly after it was written. In other words, there was a big hole that a lot of people didn't like in the constitutional system that they wanted to fix, and that's why there's what is called colloquially the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And since then, there have been many more amendments to the U.S. Constitution, either changing various things, repealing various things, or adding various things in the U.S. Constitution. And the existence of these changes all point to an idea that the government at the time considered the U.S. Constitution to be inadequate in some way. In that way, they considered it to have to either have failed exactly or to have been at risk of failing. Another example of the failing is the U.S. Civil War, which, of course, the U.S. Constitution temporarily, in the way it was formulated, managed to be acceptable to both sides of the slavery issue, at least temporarily, kicking the can down the road. But eventually, the Civil War was unavoidable from that perspective, which meant that, in that sense, it was insufficient to prevent that conflict, which in that sense was inevitable. So, another aspect, the US Congress. You have the House of Representatives. It used to be proportional based on population, but eventually people realized that there was a problem with that. That with the rising of the population, you would have a situation where either the U.S. House of Representatives became unmanageably large and therefore locked in eternal legislative gridlock, where, let's say, you've got 2,000 members, and 100 of them are proposing laws, and you just can't go through all of them. So you're stuck in a nightmare, complete legislative nightmare, where there's just too many people to make things work. And the solution that they proposed was to limit the number of members in the U.S. House of Representatives, which, of course, had the byproduct of meaning that as the population grew, they became less representative over time, defeating the purpose of having the representatives in the first place. So, in that sense, that is a failing of the American system. Now, when I say that the system has failed, I mean that it has failed in a philosophical respect, that has failed in the respect of accomplishing its purposes, not necessarily that it has failed in a sense of being functional, because it is still functional. And I'll tell you, eventually it won't be, because it obviously is not designed for infinite growth. And therefore, as the population grows, it will become less functional and more, and partisanship will become a greater cause of conflict as things expand. The states, the Senate. I talked about states' rights essentially being subverted by the fact that the states themselves, many of them, are financially dependent upon the federal government. Another way that states' rights have been subverted is the way that senators are elected. They used to be elected by the state governments, which meant that the senators uh, would, in aspects, be accountable to the state governments, and therefore would be a way of the states to protect their rights within the federal government, which was an important element of the federal system. Now that has been repealed by and replaced by a constitutional amendment that now makes the senators elected by the people, which means that the state governments don't have a voice, functionally speaking, a method of holding the federal government accountable. They can't, which means that the federal government, if they so chose, could simply put forward a constitutional amendment revoking all of the rights of the states, all of the reserved powers, and the states would not be able to do anything about it. And therefore, my voice cracked because I hadn't cleared my throat. Therefore, it means that ultimately states' rights are in constant jeopardy, because the people can simply go over the heads of their state governments and ask for their state rights to be revoked if they don't like what their states are doing, which is a problem in a government. And that's why my system is a very hierarchical system where each level directly interacts with the levels above it and levels below it, of course, in interpersonal relationships as well, in order to increase the accountability and reliability of the system. Because if you have democracy on every level, what you're going to have is a system where the people at the top can simply call upon the people in general to revoke something that someone in the middle is doing. And that, of course, in a federal system is a very bad thing, because it undermines the uh, quality of it being a federal system, in the sense that it's certainly not a federation. So the U.S., as a union of states, has really become so only in name only at this point, because at any time the federal government, should it choose to, can simply revoke all the laws of a state, and the states don't have any way of holding them accountable. So much for the division of powers, eh? So in that sense, not only from a perspective of practical government has the system fallen apart, but also from a perspective of the Enlightenment in itself has the system fallen apart as well. So, and why has it fallen apart? It is because these consensus, these ideas that people believed in past times were common sense, are actually not common sense. There's ideas that different people have that are going to lead to different conclusions that are not derived from the same axioms, and ultimately this leads to a system that is at variance with itself in a different time. And this is why the populist idea of having a social contract and of establishing that is ultimately incompatible with the idea of a liberal society. Why? Because the socialists can take advantage of those same principles and advocate for the overthrow of a liberal society, as can the fascists, as can the National Socialists, as can any other group that has a populist motivation, or any other group that defines themselves in the terms of a social contract. So, in that sense, the very means by which they deem to establish the authority of a state is also the very means by which they destroy the authorities of the states which they establish. So ultimately, what the Enlightenment thinkers on that are doing is that they create this beautiful system that is very coherent internally, where you have a division of power, separation of church and state, you have social contract, and oops, the very principles that they use to establish their system are the principles by which their system are destroyed. And that's why you see such a huge difference and a huge contrast in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which some might have thought were derived from similar principles, but ultimately the way these principles were applied, the way that they became examined in their cultures, the way that people saw them and examined them were very different. And this led to different results. So, and this is true for any revolution the world over as well. So, in that sense, I would say that the Enlightenment philosophers are unsuccessful in attempting to establish a coherent system, because their system is in fact incoherent and leads to its own destruction. Now, of course, there's different types of Enlightenment thinkers, so I'm not necessarily addressing all of them in the same way. And I will qualify and say that I certainly would probably agree with others more than certain ones. But ultimately, what I arrived to the conclusion of is that these principles upon which liberalism, upon which socialism, upon which fascism, these Enlightenment principles upon which all these different ideologies that are so popular today are based, are ultimately not coherent with the way that the real world works. And that's why these ideas have led to so much destruction in the world. That's why you have revolutions that in some countries work and in some countries don't work. That's why when people try to bring democracy to these countries that have had authoritarian principles, that this democracy is many times rejected by them. You go to certain countries in Africa, and you look at the leaders that some of them elect, and the support for the leadership might not necessarily be based on meritocratic principles, might not be based on principles of utility, might not be based on principles of who's going to get the best job done in accordance to what many Western thinkers would think, but actually could be based in certain cases. Now, I'm not saying that this is universal. In certain cases, it's based on tribal affiliation. On this person is the leader of my tribe, so I'm going to vote for them. Why? Because I'm loyal to my tribe. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying that that's going to lead to an effective system, but what I'm saying is that this type of thinking is not compatible with a type of thinking that the Enlightenment philosophers thought that these systems would encourage. So, so that's ultimately what ends up happening, is that these things collapse. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a monarchist or a reactionary in that sense. As I said, I don't take the same view as many of the anti-enlightenment thinkers that are sometimes referred to as the counter-enlightenment. I don't take those same views. I take a realist perspective, that there are certain things that work, there are certain things that don't work, that the Enlightenment thinkers had some good points, they had some good ideas, they had some good applications of ideas and things that worked, but if taken as a whole, if taken as, let's say, the liberal consensus, the Whig historiography, that they are wrong. And that's my opinion on the Enlightenment. So tell me what you think. Is there anything in particular that you agree with? Anything in particular that you disagree with? Is there something that you would like to discuss with me? I would be happy to do so. And thank you all for watching. And I'll be seeing you all next time on Wiltus. Over and out.